basically, in essence, you have to wrap your mind around the fact that there is simply no such thing as space, and there's no such thing as time. To wrap your mind around the fact that there is no such thing as space, there is what is known as quantum entanglement. Einstein hated this concept. He threw his arms up in the air and walked out of the lecture hall when it was being presented, and he said, "This is spooky action at a distance." So Albert Einstein, is proclaimed as one of the greatest minds ever, didn't like this concept. It didn't jive with him. He didn't understand it. So if one of the greatest minds, a man in the depths of physics, didn't like this concept and couldn't understand it and threw his arms up in the air, then what hope is there for you? Well, there's a lot of hope, because that was a long time ago. We've made a lot of advancements. There's look into the double slit experiment, where photons are being thrown through these slits. When there's no observer, they act like waves and they're all over the place. The second there's an observer, they all act like particles the way we expect them to. So it goes back to the Zen Buddha question: if a tree falls in the forest, did it make a sound? And the answer is no. We've learned through quantum physics in the double slit experiment that as long as there's no observer, then the event never occurred. Therefore, no forest ever existed. And if there's no forest, then the tree did not exist. And if there's no tree, then the tree could not have fallen. And therefore, the tree could not have made a sound. So the Zen Buddha answer is, if there's no one there to hear it make a sound, then the event never occurred. You have to have an observer for an event in reality to happen. This is a very bizarre concept, but hopefully you'll wrap your mind around that sooner or later. The next bizarre thing, getting back to Einstein, quantum entanglement, in essence, it states that there are particles that have a sister particle, and it doesn't matter the distance between them. They can be on opposite ends of the universe. And this is a perfectly sound theory in quantum physics. When one event happens to one particle on the other side of the universe, the exact same thing happens to the other particle on the other side of the universe, which basically proves that there is no such thing as space. It violates general relativity. But general relativity does not jive with quantum physics, and quantum physics does not jive with general relativity. You take the equations in quantum entanglement, and you say 1 plus 1 equals 2, and you go to general relativity, and 1 plus 2 equals square root 2, 2,000, all kinds of bizarre stuff. And in general relativity, 1 plus 1 equals 2, and in quantum physics equals, 10,000 square root 2, just all kinds of bizarre stuff. The equations completely fall apart. They don't jive. They don't make sense. So in one reality, they make sense, and in the other reality, they don't. So this breaks down the concept of reality, and simply to put it in layman's terms, you don't understand reality. The most brilliant minds do not understand reality. But we can observe, and we have learned through quantum entanglement and double slit experiment and other things, that reality is nothing like you thought it was. It doesn't make any sense to the logical mind, but yet it makes perfectly sound sense in the equations. So when you give it the concept of everything you know to be true is not true and throw it out the door, and you have to think outside the box, look in to the box, and go, outside the box, looking in. Now I understand. You have to understand that all things in the logical mind, for example, there are people that have the ability to transcend space and time, and they can communicate with people in the past. And you say, well, how could this be happening? Because I'm right here, I'm alive, and let's say you communicate with Nostradamus, and what you think is the present. But you say this is not logical because he died hundreds of years ago. How could I be communicating with him in the present? And then you have to step outside the box one more time and go, well, I'm not communicating with him in the present because time is not happening all at once. Time exists all at once. It's a language barrier. We are trapped by language. We are trapped by how we're brought up, our belief systems, and the way we've been programmed. It is very possible to communicate with all beings at all times, all at once. And this is what the top echelon, the elite know. They have the ability to communicate with beings in the past. So they can go back in time, which is not going back in time at all. It's because time exists all at once. And they can go to that guy who wrote the Bible. And they can go, hey, instead of saying, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And they can say, hey, change that word to in earth as it is in heaven. And because they went back in the past, which is really the present, it immediately changes everything from the past to the present and changes all our Bibles instantaneously. It's a very advanced concept and something that's hard to wrap your minds around, but this is how our Bibles are changing instantaneously. This is how movie lines are changing. This is how everything is changing instantaneously, as if it had always been that way. Because there are beings, there are people, let's say, that have this ability, and they're using technology. Sure, you can go into D-Wave, CERN, I don't care. Explain it any way you want. Find your logical explanation. But there is an organization that has the ability to communicate outside of time and space, and to go back to these people that created these events in our life that we hold dear and true. For example, Luke, I'm your father. They simply were able to communicate with that person and say, hey, don't say it's Luke, I'm your father. Change it to, no, I'm your father. And then instantaneously, everything changes in our present reality. So perhaps I can help explain this a little bit better. Some of you know about the butterfly effect. Maybe this is a way you can wrap your mind around it. If you had a time machine and you can go back in time and you accidentally step on a butterfly, and then that butterfly has a trickle-down effect and then eventually changes reality from that moment in the past all the way to the present and the future. So physicists are aware of this, and they try to explain it. So I'll show you their explanation. They explain time as we have our main timeline here. And we call this the river of life. It's a river. So when someone is able to transcend space and time and go back and say, hey, instead of saying on earth as is in heaven, change it to in earth as in heaven. And then at that exact moment, a branch is created, and we have this new timeline. And then someone says, hey, change it to, instead of, my mom always told me life was like a box of chocolates. And they say they're able to instantaneously, because all time exists all at once, they're able to tell that writer, hey, change it to, my mom always told me life is like a box of chocolates. And then we have another branch, another river, and then etc. So let's say there's a version of you that decided to instead of going out and meeting your wife and having children and having the life you had and everything, all the events that transpired from that moment, there's a version of you that stayed at home and did meet the wife and meet the kids. And that version of you continued on this timeline. Where the other version of you did go out and meet your wife and have kids, and then you branched out on this branch in this river. And then this decision was made, and you branched out over here. And then this decision was made, and you branch out over here. So we have the main timeline, the main river of life, what is known as the continuity of space and time, which remains unchanged. But as folks go back in time and change events, and back in time is a bad word. I'm just using that so it's something you can understand. They are able to, since they understand all time exists all at once, they can change this event and create a whole new reality, a whole new timeline, another reality. And then what we have is we have all these branches, and these branches is what has become known as the tree of life. So this is the true essence and the meaning of what is known as the tree of life, and how we have what has been known as this creates a parallel reality, or a parallel earth, or a parallel timeline. You know, use any language you want. And you have all these branches and all these timelines and all these possibilities, because we have learned from the double slit experiment that all things exist all at once, and that there's unlimited possibilities. We've learned from quantum physics, you can walk on a basketball court and there's 100 basketballs all over the place. And they're just there because there's no observer. And the second someone steps on the basketball court and says that the basketball should be there, boom, all at once the timelines collapse and all the positions collapse. It's called superpositioning into that one basketball. And now that basketball is just there. Yes, these are very advanced concepts and completely defy all logic, and they're very hard to wrap your mind around. But hopefully you can follow the basics, that all these alternate timelines, all these alternate possibilities, not only do they all exist at once, but they have been created and they have branched out. And what is happening is that this construct, this reality, has served its purpose. It's no longer necessary. So now it's time to bring it all into one. And as this branch collapses into this timeline, and this branch collapses in this timeline, the facts and the realities from these realities, they begin to blend and they collapse into one. So on this branch, you now have this reality, but you also have this reality and that reality, and you have all the facts, all the events that happen, and they're collapsing and they blend. And this is why some people go, wow, I have both memories of the Mandela effect. I have this memory, I have that memory, which is true. And you have this branch that's collapsing. And what's happening is all these branches and all these realities, all these timelines, all these parallel realities, all these earths are collapsing into one. And they are going to go collapsing back into the main timeline, the way it was supposed to be, the main river of life. It's of true intent and its original purpose. So everything is collapsing. Everything is blending. And that's why if you are from this reality over here, you know this to be true, and then all of a sudden there's this reality and that reality. And it's very confusing. And then we have what's called the natives, who are from timeline 0, the main timeline, and they're like, excuse me? It was never that way. You're cuckoo crazy. It was never like that. It never happened that way. You're insane. You're nuts. It's because they have been on this timeline, and they have not experienced these other timelines. But you have been on these other timelines, and they're collapsing, and you have these other realities. You have these other experiences. You have these memories, but they're being collapsed into the main reality. And this leaves you in a state of confusion because you're like, well, how could this be? Well, I just told you how it could be. Because you were on the main timeline and you branched off and you went over here. And as the timelines are collapsing, things change. And this is why, for example, it was the Flintstones for a long time. And then as the Flintstones without the T, and I did a video on this, people said you're crazy, you're on drugs, you're on crack. It's always been the Flintstones. You remember being Flint because of the Flint starts fire, and and I got ridiculed. Um, but guess what? Now it's back to the Flintstones. So we have seen that Mandela effect go from my rally, the Flintstones, to this rally, Flintstones, back to the Flintstones. And so all these memories, all these different facts, all these different realities, they're all melting and blending and becoming one. And we're going to eventually get back to the original main timeline, back to the original River of Life, the way it was supposed to be. And then once everything collapses and it gets back to the way it was supposed to be, and everything is corrected and returned to its original purpose, then the main timeline and the main River of Life will move forward back to its original purpose and design. So for those of you who experienced the Mandela effect, you were off on this timeline or that timeline or this branch over here, and it's all very confusing as everything blends back to one. And then you have all the folks that were always on this timeline going, "You're crazy, it's always been this way." But think of it from a moment, let's say everything collapsed all over to this timeline over here, and to you, it's always been Luke, I'm your father, but over here, it's always been no, I'm your father. What if this timeline collapsed in your timeline? Now all these people are totally confused. They're like, "Oh, it's always been no, I'm your father. It's always been, it's a beautiful day in this neighborhood." And then they got thrown onto your timeline where it's always been, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It's always been, "Luke, I'm your father." And then now you would look like the same person, and they all look like the crazy person. But it's not happening that way for you. You are being collapsed into their timeline. So these folks have all the evidence, all the proof, because everything has always been this way on their timeline. So timelines are collapsing and merging into one. We are correcting what should have never been. We are fixing what should not have been fixed. It shouldn't be necessary, but it is. And we're fixing everything. We're going to get everything back onto its original main timeline, to the main River of Life, and then we'll move forward like a nice, steady flowing river back to its original purpose.